So here we go. The first of all, I was going to talk a little bit about Bill Dahl. There's his picture. This is one of his better pictures in his, I guess, before he got sick. He was my major professor. And he did his doctoral dissertation on John Dewey at Johns Hopkins. He grew up in Marblehead, Mass, suburb of Boston. I kind of came to him indirectly at LSU. My first two major professors left the university, so I sort of landed on Bill, and it was a godsend. Because we worked well together, and he gave of his time. He was very generous with his time to all of his grad students. One of the things the underlying theme of much of his research was to critique method. He didn't like the notion of teaching method, and particularly its ties to curriculum. And so, those who read Harvey, y'all have read Harvey. He is the one that introduced me to Peter Ramus. He disliked Ramus a lot more than I did. I made the argument, and we would argue about this, that Ramus in himself wasn't as bad as the people who followed Ramus, who used Ramus to really create this notion of shortcut. I think we get a sense of that with Harvey. Harvey's kind of the in-between guy. And because Harvey was still very much coming out of a late medieval concept, his focus was still rhetoric rather than composition. So by the mid 17th century, you then begin to get a sense of more of the shortcut notion. It's very interesting. Begin to take a look at books that were published initially in this mid 17th century, and they all seem to have a diagram, a word map of the book, of the text at the beginning of the book. So as if they're directing you to how to read the work. And this was very much comes out of the Ramus and the shortcut. So a lot of his work was about trying to get teachers to be more generative, and so we'll talk about that in the presentation today. Bill Dahl passed away in Christmas of I want to say 2017, maybe it's 2018. It is a year and a half ago, I guess, 2018. And he had been sick for about 2 years. He had kidney disease, and so he died like the 27th of December. I got to speak to him the last time around December 8th. I always sent him Christmas candy and Christmas cookies at Christmas. And he was living up in Canada. He retired to Canada with his wife, his second wife. So So very much miss the guy. So, and we did, as students and friends, put together an edited work, came out last year, contributed to. So it'd be interesting to have a class on that one day. Okay, so I will stop sharing Bill Dahl. Oh, and he was very tall. He was 6'4". And his hair was usually a lot longer than it is in this picture. So he was quite a scene walking through the halls of Peabody Hall at LSU. And he loved to walk. We'd go to conferences and go take walks and talk and that kind of stuff. So when we'd drive to conferences and talk about stuff, those are also some very, very sweet memories. Okay. Let me, so now I'm going to share the notes. So keeping knowledge alive. Let's see. All right, any quick questions before we get started? Okay, well, you see when I did these notes, in fact, I just updated them, so I'm gonna have to change that date. And the piece you read, Keeping Knowledge Alive, begins as a lecture that he gave. So, and what you read is actually a draft of that lecture. It is now published, and I'll probably for the fall I'll have the published work, and it's essentially the same. There may be some slight differences. And so he initially presented that paper at LSU. He came to visit, and so that's the first time I heard it. So again, in the current environment in which teachers are asked to teach and teach to the test, in which they're now often handed prescribed curriculum, not just a curriculum constrained by standards or guides. Keeping knowledge alive has become a great challenge. And, from in this class, teachers are often writing about this in their glosses and their projects. So I know it's a great concern. At some point, I believe the pendulum will swing. Now, when that will be, I don't know. Hard to predict, given our current environment. But I do believe, from a political perspective, since we're very much controlled by politics and education, that either side of the spectrum, whether they're liberal or conservative, have a vested interest in prescribed curriculums, which is very interesting, I think. So there really aren't any or many political voices. There are some that kind of oppose the current regime. And I think a lot of it has to do with control. And it has a lot to do with dollars. So a key focus of this course is an attempt to provide you as teachers ways to keep knowledge alive and let you try to engage in a practice in which you can try as often as you can to avoid inert knowledge. And it's kind of the point of the curriculum project. So whether it's Harvey or this reading or the G book, certainly the next readings of Aoki and curriculum, but they're all geared to thinking through the curriculum project and trying to come up with ways to and that's the part of the point of differentiation. I think districts at times play lip service to differentiation, but it's often difficult, given the conditions, to truly differentiate for our students. Another thing that's good about using this paper and the Harvey paper is without having you read Whitehead, who I think is a very important education thinker, although his ideas on education are nearly 100 years old. So the piece that both I and Dahl refer to in Harvey and in this paper were initially published in 1928. So we're getting close to that centennial. And obviously, it's all still very timely. So this is a way for you to get Whitehead without reading a full Whitehead. And his works, either The Rhythm of Education or The Aims of Education, which are both referred to here, are readily available. I think they're available online. So, so Whitehead, when he's writing, he's arguing against the testing culture of the English university, which still exists. It fell on deaf ears. So his argument is pretty clear: do not teach too many subjects. And I think we can kind of understand that, given particularly in middle and high school, the breadth of subjects that students are asked to take. But he does argue that what you teach thoroughly, and let the main ideas be few and important. So in I argue, you can think of the standards as the main ideas. So in putting it this way, teach what you teach thoroughly, don't teach too many subjects. In many ways, Whitehead is coming out of a Ramus tradition. Now, Whitehead, of course, is teaching at Cambridge, which was initially for a while a Ramus university before the Restoration, meaning in the 17th century when the crown was restored after the Calvinist Republic no, the name's gonna forget me. And anyway.
You're talking about
Cromwell.
The Calvinists with Cromwell? Yeah,
Cromwell.
Oliver Cromwell. Yeah.
It came to me.
Yeah, and away from all those secret Catholics at Oxford.
Correct.
Yeah.
So thank goodness for the secret Catholics from my perspective.
I think for not to get too off subject, but I think for at least the liberal arts, we can say thank you to a lot of the secret Catholics at Oxford.
Yeah.
So
because basically what Whitehead is arguing here is to limit the curriculum, but to teach it thoroughly, and so that's the gist of Ramus's ideas too. Teach what you teach thoroughly. But don't teach too much. But Whitehead, unlike Ramus, would say, let the ideas be thrown into every combination possible. This is, I argue, and I think Dahl argues, this is what depth of the curriculum looks like. When you throw things together, put things in different combinations, so you can more fully understand what that knowledge represents. So the to pick up, in most of these, in these 3 bullet points are really from his Aims of Education, which is the first essay in his book of essays. The Rhythm of Education which I talked about and Dahl talks about, is the second essay. And here in the next quote, Whitehead is talking about the aims of the rhythm of education. And he says, the aimless accumulation of precise knowledge or training alone or precision imposed too early is self-defeating. So basically what he's arguing here is precision kills romance. And of the three aspects of his rhythms of education, romance is clearly the most important for Whitehead, because that's what gets students excited, interested, willing to explore. Today, in our curriculums that are prescribed and teach to the test, it is all about precision. It's all about trying to make sure students get the right answers in the test. Inevitably, what is proved to do that is they don't learn it well enough to get the right answers. They learn it initially, and then somebody wrote about this in their Harvey gloss, where they learn it just long enough to pass the teacher test, and then they forget it as you quickly move on. So this is an issue, and you have two things that work with this overemphasis on precision. I think, first of all, we don't learn it well enough. There isn't an overlearning process going on, which is a process I was always taught. When I taught at LSU and I taught how to study in college, we taught a process of overlearning so you can do well on your college tests, okay? But we don't get that. There's not enough time in the day with all of the information. So that jumps back to the previous bullet points. The other thing, without that deeper knowledge, it's difficult for students to transfer knowledge they learn in one subject to the knowledge that they're being asked to learn in another subject.
Dr. Trish, I'm actually reading The Knowledge Gap, as part of PD for the summer, and something that is being emphasized, I'm an ELA teacher. And so something that's emphasized in this book is that we teach kids skills, but a lot of times they can't apply those skills because they don't have the knowledge needed to decode what they're reading. Now, granted, I'm an elementary teacher, so a lot of my emphasis is on decoding and reading to learn, but we don't teach kids what they need to succeed. A lot of times when we're teaching strictly skills.
Yeah. And that's dibbles, or as I describe it, dribbles.
Yeah.
Because it's about decoding. The problem is we can teach kids to decode. I learned how to decode in Russian, right? So I could read. I probably can't do it anymore because I don't remember the alphabet that well. But I could read Russian, but I didn't necessarily know what the word meant. Okay, because Russian's very phonetic. It's not unlike English, right? And so English is even harder to read. The problem is if the word is not in the student's oral lexicon, right? If they don't know the word orally, then they don't understand its meaning. And that really kind of goes back, and Ramus actually talks about this. So one of the other things I like about Ramus is he says meaning is not a formal thing that you can teach through school. It's something that has to be acquired in our everyday lives. Okay. Now, where I would disagree slightly, but of course he's talking about Latin. Okay. So if the student doesn't come with a good oral foundation of Latin, it's difficult to teach them the meaning of those Latin words as I'm teaching him the different arts. What we do know is that the verbal ability of the teacher, as defined by SAT journal or the ACT test, has a great bearing on student learning. And so, your ability to use, complex words and highfalutin, dollar words, we used to call them in school, is actually a good thing, even though students look at you cross-eyed sometimes. Because all you do is stop and explain what that means and keep using it. But my example of a word that it took me close to 10 years to really fully grasp the meaning is a philosophical concept called epistemology, okay, which it means the theory of knowledge. And even the idea of a theory of knowledge was difficult for me to understand. But it took a while. And so, if I began to sit here and talk about epistemology, most of you, Austin probably being the exception, would not know what I was talking about. And another word is phenomenology. So the epistemology of phenomenological philosophical perspectives, has meaning for me, but it wouldn't have any meaning for you. So that gives you an idea about some of this. And the idea of, so we get back to precision being self-defeating. If you have to get the answer right in a very particular way all the time, and you aren't able to, then that just kills, and I think that's kind of the way I felt about math. Because I was never able to get the answer right, it seemed like. And so I'd had very little use for math. Although I learned, what I ended up discovering in the Navy, when I would take math tests, I actually knew a lot of the algebra. Part of that was because it took me 3 years to get through Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. And it says something about the two brothers that taught me. Both of them scared me to death. But anyway,
I will say this. When I was in my undergrad, Doc, it was the first time that kind of that someone explained to me, why we have math in school. I mean, yes, there's practical uses for it in, everyday society. But I took basically I think it was a 117 course or something like that. It was basically the philosophy of math. And it wasn't until then that I had it explained to me like that I really kind of got an appreciation for math. I've always hated math, didn't like it, but it just basically took someone, explaining to you why we have math in school, for me to get kind of a better appreciation. I guess for me to have a little bit more interest in the subject in itself.
Right. And
because I thought it was just very sterile.
Yeah, my interest grew too in graduate school, or in the doctoral program. And Bill Dahl he wasn't originally a math guy, but it's something he learned to teach. And he liked to play with math. He liked to play with those ideas. Interestingly, Whitehead co-authored with Bertrand Russell, the Principia Mathematica, which is the foundation of mathematical logic. Whitehead is not an intellectual slouch in any way, shape, or form. So Whitehead says that the Romance stage concerns itself with unexplored connections, with possibilities half disclosed and half concealed. And I think the half disclosed and half concealed statement is important. It goes back to Harvey's notion of novelty, I think. But if we just, we get a half disclosure, then we begin to wonder, well, what's the rest of the story, to quote Paul Harvey? And what is it that's being concealed? So that precision kills off thought, kills off intellectual curiosity. For Dahl, coming out of Dewey, Dahl talks about this in terms of play, kind of intellectual play, playing with the subject. This too is related to Dahl's rejection of method and rejection of the second half of the word curriculum, culum, which is where the idea of a shortcut of knowledge comes from. The short track versus the big, chariot circus that we see in Ben-Hur. He pulls upon ideas from an author named Genova, who writes about Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is a 20th century philosopher. He's a student of Bertrand Russell's. He's part of the Cambridge group between the two world wars. We actually began began Cambridge earlier, before the First World War. He's a logician. Russell hoped that he would do for philosophical logic what he and Whitehead had done for mathematical logic. But Wittgenstein gamed him a little bit. Didn't go that way. And in his later philosophy, Wittgenstein talks a lot about play and playing games, and the resemblances amongst games. Because if you look at the list of all games, there's nothing identical about that list. Each game would have something relatable, but then part of, but other things would have differences, but still some things relatable and on such. So that's the idea of resemblance rather than similarity. Now, Bill Dahl begins to learn his Wittgenstein from me. In addition to Ramus, I extended Ramus's logics to Wittgenstein in my dissertation. And I was first introduced to Wittgenstein in an Eastern European history class. He was originally from Vienna. And it's a very interesting family. They at one time were the second richest family in Europe. Wittgenstein's a very interesting person. Now, so they talk about, Genova talks about this idea of playing at, playing with, and playing in. So the most, according to Bill and a couple of other authors that I know pretty well that wrote about this, of the three, playing with is the most generative in their concept. So this is what Dahl's really trying to get us to. Playing at something is playing with it precisely. It's like playing with the toy the way it's supposed to be played with. Playing with is playing with the toy, but doing something different. And playing in is really about learning how to play with the toy. So that's the nature of the three concepts. I do take a bit exception to that definition, but that's for another talk. One of the things that struck me about Wittgenstein is he says, and this is kind of Wittgenstein's anti-method. that to teach something is not to teach one thing. So this is very anti-Ramus, because Ramus argued that you teach one thing. You don't, each subject to its own. So this is something I like to talk to my undergraduates about, particularly in the social studies. When you teach a historical concept, it's related to that historical concept may have a place in history, okay, but it also has a place in geography or economics or government, right? It's psychology. I mean, it actually can be related to any number of concepts, but it also might be related to scientific concepts, to language concepts, all these things. So when you teach something, and you want to be able to, when you teach something, is help students understand some of these relationships, between a single piece of knowledge and all these other ideas. The same would be true in a scientific concept. So what is the historical foundation of that scientific concept? Math in algebra and mathematics. What's the historical foundation of that? Well, it's not, math is not created from thin air. So there's a historical, philosophical way of thinking, for that. I mean, why does Descartes develop his method and his trig, sitting in a snowbound cabin at the point in time that he does? What is the social milieu that helps formulate that? So the initial stage of any learning has to have some sense of romance, according to Whitehead, and this is certainly true of Dahl as well, because it is this romance that establishes the ground of the prior knowledge, if you will, for future learning. And it recognizes Aristotle's concept that all learning moves logically from the known to the unknown. Okay. I argue that you need to try to find ways to relate curriculum knowledge to a student's understanding of local knowledge. Okay. So by doing that, students have something to grasp onto so that they can then begin to learn. This is why I think one of the more important skills a teacher can have is listening to her students or his students, listening to how they talk about things. I remember evaluating a intern in the middle. She was teaching a biology lab, and they just happened to be dissecting the frog. Now, structurally, she was doing everything she was supposed to do, making sure they filled out the chart properly, making sure they were cutting the frog open properly, all those technical aspects of, of a lab. Okay. Finding the right answer, all this stuff. What she wasn't doing that I got to do was, as I was evaluating her, was listen to these groups of students talk about the frog as they cut it open. And it was quite interesting how they described what they saw. Now, it had no bearing on the scientific knowledge, but somebody that knew the frog, as this teacher would, more so than even I would. I hadn't cut open a frog since probably 1968 or 69. So, but clearly they're describing things in the frog that had a scientific, there was a related scientific word. And had the teacher been able to listen to that, she could have used that language to teach the concepts that she was trying to get them to learn. I think one of the difficulties we have as teachers today is that the technologies, and I'm not talking about the ones we use in schools, right? So the technologies, the iPhones, the smartphones, the different apps and things that students have access to are much more interesting than what we do in school. We can never keep up, okay? So, I agree with Aristotle, who says you cannot teach something you do not know, okay? So we have to have an established knowledge base to teach that knowledge base. But the student can learn emerging knowledges in ways that teachers can never teach it. Okay. And this is what's new about our age of teaching. Most of our established curriculums and coming out of the early part of the 20th century was at a point in time when we used schools to teach both immigrants and migrants, right? In the coming out of the teens, 20s, and 30s, knowledges that they needed to live in the cities, particularly. We can think about that curriculum as being related to kind of the progressive notions of how to live healthy in a city. And what we did was we would teach the students these concepts so that they would bring those concepts home to parents. Okay. And this worked well, into the 60s. But as technologies begin to emerge, really in the 80s to some degree, and as you begin to see this rapid transformation of technology with the computer and everything that flows from that, then the teachers are no longer there teaching the technology because the students have already learned it before they get to their classrooms. So that's one of the challenges. How do we create romance about things that are as old as the curriculum? Because you think about what we teach, it's very mature knowledge, whether it's in English or history or in the sciences, okay? Certainly our mathematics, have been around. Most of the mathematics you get in high school, has been around since Descartes, because Descartes invented trig, or at least Newton in the invention of calculus. We don't seem to go much beyond that. So all that's is fairly established. And so maybe a certain level of novelty has worn off. So generalization is the final stage. So once you have some precision, then you begin to generalize from that. Once you have a full knowledge base, Whitehead would argue, now you want to return to romance, and to get students interested in the knowledge in a more deep way, to begin to try to see connections on their own. To then get them to think about the power of knowledge that goes beyond the first encounter. One is now able to focus on relationships, just on seeing patterns among the facts being studied. But, is my parentheses, this requires fluency, which I'm concerned is, fluency was not, the attempt to reach fluency was not part of Common Core. And this is because I would ask questions when we got introduced to Common Core about fluency, because it's fluency that allows you to play, because you don't always have to look up stuff. You know it as you know, like the back of your hand. And so that, just like, knowing the multiplication tables well allows you to do division well, okay? Because you have that sense of fluency in multiplication. Okay, so looking at the time. The reason for throwing ideas and facts into various combinations has been to help students see relationships, interconnections, patterns. It is at this level of thought that Whitehead believes one begins to make knowledge one's own. Okay, so if we teach students how to make knowledge their own, then that enables them to be lifelong learners. They understand how to do that for themselves. This used to be, before the test, this used to be the end goal of high school, was to create independent learners, okay? This was, when I taught remedial classes at the university, at LSU, our goal was to help them achieve what they hadn't in high school already, how to be independent learners, okay? How to think about learning, how to think about knowledge, the kinds of things that you would do, to allow them to, to do various kinds of projects, creative writing, the essay, to do higher level math, all this kinds of stuff. So, and here's another little bit of Whitehead from the Aims of Education, where he says, this is about why knowledge is important. And he says, where attainable knowledge could have changed the issue, ignorance has the guilt of vice. Okay, so I'll unpack that a little bit. Where attainable knowledge could have changed how a student lives their life. They're able to live a better life because of what you taught them. That's the goal. Because if they remain ignorant, then they cannot achieve that. And Whitehead argues that has the guilt of vice. Okay. And I think the people that develop our curriculum, the people that adhere to the test, forgets this, or don't understand how to get there. Okay, because if you learn it for a test, you're not going to remember it for life, I guess. So I argue it's not about good teaching. Looking at Whitehead and Dahl, all the things that I do, it's not about good teaching, it's about good learning. Are we teaching our students to be good learners? In other words, are we teaching them, and this is kind of a Ramus concept, are we teaching them the formal structures of learning that they need to live a better life? Okay, to go beyond. Whether they go on to college or whether they go into a trade, it's all really about the same thing. I find it interesting where we want to separate the trades curriculum from the college curriculum, because I don't see these as that fundamentally different in terms of creating what I would call good citizens. Okay, teaching them how to live in a free society, which is all too important. So teaching that leads to good learning is teaching that makes the teacher transparent, ever present, but hovering in the background. I don't know about any of you, but through much of my life, as I learn things, as I engage in learning, particularly certain topics, I think of teachers that I had, particularly in high school. I still hear their voices, even though next year it'll be 50 years since I graduated from Brother Martin. So 50th anniversary, reunion coming up. Hopefully COVID won't ruin that. Anyway, so that's what I have. Hopefully this helps. Any questions?
Doc, I wanted to just ask you quickly, with the connections that we've made today, or that you kind of expounded on today, and especially what's going on in current events, how much do you think of, what we've kind of seen today and through some of our other readings really connects to what's happening in our current events and our current society today? I'm just interested in, I know it's a very general question and not really specific, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I'll answer it this way. Paraphrasing Spinoza, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Right.
So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Because it could become politically charged, but hopefully not.
It could, yeah.
All righty. Anybody else? But a good question. Very good question. Okay. Well, hopefully this helps with the gloss. And I think I kind of expounded beyond the reading a little bit. But I know I focused on Whitehead rather than Dahl. But you can see for this article, you could see Dahl and Whitehead as being one. So, all right. Well, y'all have a good afternoon. Y'all take care.
Thank you, Doc.
All righty.